want to welcome everyone as we do, and certainly anyone watching on YouTube as we tackle today something that is tough. Now, we don't have someone coming up and reading the scripture today. It's just a couple of verses. But today we're going to try and tackle a challenge that we looked at last week. And last week we looked at that of Noah and the ark. Noah and the flood in particular. As I was spending some time this week, I came across the reference to a film. I believe it came out in 2004. And I tried to get it, tried to find it, but I could not find it. It was put out on the BBC, and the title was God on Trial. And that title grabbed me. And that's why it's called God on Trial today. The film was all about a scene within one of the Hitler's concentration camps. It was a group of Jews who had gotten together and understandably were angry about the situation that they were in. And the question was, does God really care about the situation and the suffering that we are experiencing right now? I'm going to find the film somehow. It has absolutely grabbed me, and I don't know how I'm going to find it, but I'm going to figure a way to contact the BBC, get a hold of Boris Johnson or something like that, or even talk to Bethany, see if she can put a word in for me to see if we can find out how to get hold of this film. Today we are going to look at just a couple of verses in Genesis. We did look at some of the areas around that in this particular event of the flood last week. But today I want to look at specifically about the disturbing events regarding the flood itself. Hopefully give you some things to think about, but we only have 30 minutes. So there's only so much that we're going to be able to do because there are some big questions. And there's some difficult things. And the reality is, for everyone here, if you are here as a believer, I hope that you will have at least thought about this, and there are some things that are disturbing to you. Because there are some things in here that are disturbing to me, and I need to come up with some answers. Because if I'm going to be able to worship God as God wants me to worship Him, but I see these kinds of things happening, how do the two match up? Even more, if I'm to engage in a world of people who are skeptics, people who will look at every possible opportunity to say this whole God thing is an absolute pile of tosh, then I need to be able to have some answers to be able to come to grips with what this thing is all about. The issue is, as we look at the verses, and let me go ahead. So open to Genesis chapter 6. We're just going to look at verses 5 through 7. And we're going to, last time we looked at sort of an understanding of what the passage was speaking of, and how it applies to us, and what we can learn from it. But now we want to look at more specifically the flood itself, and then we're going to bring out the issue, bring out the problems. So Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7 says this. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. We talked about how extreme that was. And the Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and He was grieved in His heart. I want you to hold on to that phrase. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created. Interesting, He puts in that phrase as well. From the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. Then verse 8 talks about Noah. We dealt with that last week, so we're not going to go that direction today. The issue is, as we look at this thing of God seeing the condition of the world, if I was to meet you out on the street or in the pub or in the cafe, and we were to talk about this, what are some of the thoughts that you would think about when we talk about this thing of God destroying everything because of what these adults were doing? What would some of the things? Would you say, I can understand that if someone today was to commit a murder, then they would be punished because of the murder they committed. If someone committed a rape, they would be punished according to the actions that they did. And we understand that because that's the system we live in. We get that. However, the problem is what? It says that God's going to wipe the earth. What about the children? Were they part of the judgment that God brought? They weren't? Oh, where'd they go? Where'd the children? Was it? And maybe another question is, was this a worldwide flood? Or was it just in Noah's hometown? How do we look at that? Well, how do we understand the verses? Okay? There again, either we have to look at it as this is God's word, it's true, or it's not true. If it's not true, then we should just go home and shut the door and have a cup of tea first, though. So what does it say? He says, I will destroy man, whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And if you were to look within the context, the ones who were left were Noah, is how many sons? 3 sons and their wives. How many people in total? 8 people in total. So if you were to understand that, that would mean that everyone else alive on the earth, including the children, including the animals, including the insects, including the trees, including the flowers, God had wiped. Now, is this a moral problem? Is this a moral dilemma? Is this an issue? I agree with you. I understand. So, number one, is it true? Is it true? If it's not true, then like I said, we don't have a problem. If it is true, then we need to be able to think about this and how to be able to understand this in our understanding about God and who God is. I would like to suggest this morning that it is true, although I was reading someone and they said, I've been a teacher of Old Testament from the Hebrew for 40 years, and his view was that this was a localized flood, and it wasn't a worldwide flood. It was a localized flood, so there was just only Noah's community that was destroyed, and not around the world. Okay, well, you can say, well, so not everyone on the earth was destroyed, and how far was the population? Well, we don't know, and he wouldn't know, and so there's all kinds of problems with that. When you look at the text, I would struggle to see a localized flood. Okay, the way I see it, the way I read it, the way the whole text gives, that it was a worldwide flood, and there's lots of, creation.com, you can go onto there and you see all kinds of stuff to talk about, was it a worldwide flood, and what evidence of it, and all these kinds of things. We mentioned last time that there were, remember, marine fossils up on, what mountain was it? Everest? Remember that? And how that as the flood came, all the earth, what we see as mountains now, how they would come up and all these kinds of things, all these complications. The point is, that I want to get across, we've got an issue to try and sort as best we can to try and understand this. So, let's try and tackle this as best we can, and I don't want you to be confused. Okay? I don't want you to be confused. We want to try and give you some things that we can grab hold of, put in our pocket, and take home to help us maybe think about this, because this is an issue. So first of all, let's ask this question. Why is this confusing? Why is it confusing? We can say that it's confusing, but I think it's another question to ask why it is confusing. Let me say, the way I view it, the way I see it, I'm going to say there are three layers to this. You may disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. But I see three layers. And the first layer I'm going to call is the theological layer. Theological layer. So theology means what? Okay, we don't. I try not to throw around words that we don't know what the meaning is. But theology is what? Give me a brief meaning. What does it mean? Theology. What does that mean?
The Bible, the teaching.
Not history. No. Theology. If anyone has remember the.
Is it theories on?
No. Theology. Okay, the bit theo means what? Remember? Anyone who's been through our little Christianity course on the basics, it means God. Okay. So theology is nothing more than the study of God. So theo means God. Ology is from the Greek word logos, which means word. So God, word, study of God. That's simply all that it is. So when we look at the theological layer, that means that we're looking at, from a Bible perspective only, how do we see this? First of all, from a theological perspective, now hold fire, we're going to get to other things as well. First of all, couple bits of review. We know that God created everything. From the Bible, someone may say, well, what if someone doesn't believe that God created everything? Okay. But we're saying this is from a theological perspective, from the Bible perspective. We say that God created everything. If God created everything, that means that God created all people. God created all the animals. And if you say, well, God didn't create me, or Liana, or Steve, or Doreen, well, did he? Well, you weren't in the Garden of Eden, but Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, and we were all from Adam and Eve. So therefore, we could say that God has created everything, and everything that came from that initial stuff. Secondly, we can say that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. That means that God is the boss. He is the one who is in full control. So those two things we have talked about so many times, you're probably sick of me hearing it. You're probably sick of me saying it. However, we need to not forget those two basic things. However, this next bit is so incredibly important. This next bit says that culturally, we have pushed God out the door. Would you say that as a culture? I'm not saying RCBC, and I'm not saying other churches or churches in Ukraine or whatever, but can we say as a culture we have pushed God out the door and shut the door? Yes. We don't think biblically anymore. What man says, what man comes up with is the way it is. And to say, and then we can go to so many other subjects and so many other things and deal with this, but as a culture, we don't think about what the Bible says and how it works from a Bible perspective. If we look back in the garden, God had set up the rules. Remember? In the beginning, Adam and Eve, garden, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of, what's the other tree? Tree of what? Life. Tree of life. Loads of other trees, but those two specific trees are mentioned. God said to Adam and Eve, He said, I don't want you to eat from that tree, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you do, you will die. What does death mean? Death means separation. Now, Adam and Eve did not die physically straight away, but they died spiritually. They were separated from God. God booted them out of the Garden of Eden. He set up the angel, the flaming sword, and then they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. But not only that, there were penalties as well. Do you remember the penalties? He said to Adam, He said, you're going to now work from the sweat of your brow. The ground is going to bring up thorns and thistles and weeds. Can you believe that? Isn't it a hassle?
God's fault.
No, it's Adam's fault. Spend more time weeding those strawberry plants than I do getting strawberries out. What a hassle that is. Chad said he spent, I'm not sure you can call it, all that, the dead grass in between, trying to get all that cleaned up. Point is, If you look in the beginning where Adam and Eve had that garden, can you imagine not having to weed anything? Can't imagine that. Didn't have to weed anything. But God said to Adam, you're going to work by the sweat of your brow. You're going to have to weed. You're going to have to take care of the ground. Whereas before it was all taken care of. He said to Eve, he said, you're going to have pain and childbearing. Okay? Now, how it would have worked, how that not have happened, I don't know. But we won't think about that. Okay? The point is, we have pushed God out of the culture. But the reality is that God still sets up the law and He sets up the penalty just like in the Garden of Eden. Number four in this whole theological layer. And I want you to think about this. God is the owner. God is the owner. Does God have a legal right? Now I want you to just think legal now. Does God have a legal right to do what He wants to do?
Yes.
He does. He does. And we're just talking just strictly hard stuff now. He has a legal right to do what He wants to do. Do you think God plays rock, paper, scissors with what He does? Random. Leon has this up. They play rock, paper, scissors in Ukraine. Can't remember what the words are. That's okay. So God does not play rock, paper, scissors with His creation. There is a purpose in what He does. There's purpose. Now, I want us to hold that in mind. Let's turn over in the New Testament now to Romans chapter 9. Go with me there, please, to Romans chapter 9. I want us to see something. Romans chapter 9. You're going to be familiar with this little story. Do you remember Moses and the Ten Commandments and all that sort of thing? Of course you do. If you remember throughout how many different plagues were there, by the way? How many different plagues? 10. There was 10. Do you remember reading through that, and as God brought in one of the plagues, Pharaoh had said, okay, you can take the Jewish people and go out and worship, but you need to leave the children here. And various other sort of things that he did. But all throughout those plagues, there are some times when the Bible says that Pharaoh hardened his heart against God. There were other times where the Bible says that what? Do you know what else it says? Other times. That, Liliana? That God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So how do you put those together? How do you put those together? Let's see. Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9, verse 14 says, what shall we say? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. That's no way. Impossible. There cannot be unrighteousness with God. For He says to Moses, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whomever I will have compassion. God is sovereign. He is in full control. So then it is not Him who wills or Him who runs, but God who shows mercy. Now notice in verse 17 and 18. For the Scripture says to Pharaoh, there we go. He says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I, God, have raised you, Pharaoh, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Therefore He has mercy on whom He wills, and on whom He wills, He hardens. Here's the point. Here's the point. God's got a grand plan. God's got a plan. And there are some times that He uses the natural will and desire of people, and sometimes He brings in His own purposes and things that He does that He would harden Pharaoh's heart. Sometimes Pharaoh hardens his own heart, but God knows that Pharaoh's heart is going in that direction. Okay? He knows that that is the condition of Pharaoh's heart. So, that's the theological layer. Lots of other things that we could talk about that, but we'll leave it with that. We'll leave it with that. That's the easy one. That's the easy one. It's the easy one to understand. Here's a tough one. Here's a tough one. The second one we're going to call is the emotional layer. The emotional layer. And this is where it gets so many people. Now, it's been interesting. I love watching people and sort of seeing categories of people, almost to the one. It's the nurses. It's those who care for other people on a professional level who have a greater problem with this. Why? Because their natural gifts are to do what?
Save.
To save, to care for other people, to make sure that everybody is okay. So they come to this event, and that just goes against how God has made them. It goes against their natural direction. There are some people who are just tough as nails. I mean, nothing bothers them. Right? Nothing bothers them. But the reality is, we are all emotional people, some more than others. Some more than others. I was here at Homestar 2 or 3 days ago. And we've got a chappie here who uses the room, and he left a bag of stuff here, and so his wife calls me up and said, oh, he left the bag of stuff, can I come pick it up? And sure enough, we arranged the time. She comes driving up, and she's there, tears. Just a bag of stuff. And so here, she told me the story. She said in our garden, we have a fence. And she said a whole bunch of weeds, like one of these growing vines. She was cutting this vine off this fence, and she didn't know that there was a bird's nest in this vine. The bird's nest fell down. I can tell right now. I can tell right now who are the emotional people. How can I tell? Facing like that. The non-emotional people are. She said the bird's nest fell down, and there was 2 or 3 of the little birds. They were there, and they may have gotten hurt. And she said, I just started crying. She went up to her husband and said, I can't believe what I've done. I went to cut this hedge. I cut these weeds off. I had this bird nest, and it fell down. And so? And she didn't understand why he was reacting like that. He didn't understand why she was reacting like that. So what'd she do? She gathered them up. And there's a bloke in the village. You know who his name is? He's called Patty. He's called Patty. So he is the bird taker care person. Okay? So if this happens to any of you, look on Facebook. His name's Patty. I can't remember the surname. Everybody knows Patty. He takes care of all the birds. Okay? Fetch them over. I think we've done it before, haven't we, Lisa? We've taken Patty a bird or so. And so she took all those birds over to Patty, and I don't know I know what happened. But it just showed so clearly there are some people who are emotional, some people are not so emotional. And so for this particular story, this particular event will impact some of us more than others, just because of how we are, how we're built. Some of us are built more emotional, some of us are not built so emotionally. And that's okay, by the way. That's okay. What we have to be careful of, if you're an emotional person, don't be judgmental on the non-emotional person. What? How can you not understand those lies? And then you come to the other direction. Come on now, it's just a bird, right? From the other direction. And it's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. However, we need to realize that God is also emotional. God has emotions. Do you ever stop and think about that? That God has emotions. God has emotions. How do you think God felt? And we actually touched on this when we looked back in the Garden of Eden. How that God was there. And do you think God was aware of the scene of what was happening as Satan was there embodied within that serpent? And there was Eve.
Yes.
And God was watching all these things happen. Do you think God had no interest in what was going on? Of course not. Do you think God was invested in what was going on? Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine maybe God was in the background. He's saying, Eve, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. And then when Eve took that fruit, ate that fruit, and she gave it to her husband, and he ate it, what do you think happened within the heart of God? Absolutely destroyed. The ones that he had created in his image. Matter of fact, the only thing that God had created in his image are the ones that rebelled against him. Do the birds rebel against God? No. Do the elephants, do the giraffes at the wildlife park rebel against God? Do even Doreen's lion rebel against God in the garden, in wildlife park? No. No. Adam and Eve. God's crowning achievement of creation. The ones who rebelled against God. And it must have broke his heart. As Abel and Cain were there in those early days, not too far from the time that Adam and Eve had rebelled against God, and as Cain rose up and killed his brother, do you think that broke the heart of God? Better believe it. And then, as God was approaching him, he said, you know the line? Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother? And do I have responsibility for him? No. Of course I know where. Of course, I mean, God knew what had happened. He was trying to get Cain to confess. But he learned from his mother and father, pointing the finger, right? I didn't do it. Not me. Must have broken God's heart. And then as time went on, as people had rebelled and sin built up, I can imagine God was watching everything that was happening. And God was thinking, look what's going on. Look what's going on in the world. All the way up to the time leading up to Noah, and it must have absolutely broke God's heart. And so what happens now is that we come to this time, and the problem is we allow our emotions to overtake what we know about God. This is what happens sometimes. Okay, we know God is loving. We know God cares. We know God is interested. But because we've got all this emotional stuff happening deep within, we let that overtake. We let that control what we think. That becomes the problem. So we have the theological layer, we've got the emotional layer, but then even a more difficult one, if it's possible, and it is possible, we have what I'm going to call the moral layer. The moral layer. Eric, is it moral what God did? And everyone almost say, almost for sure, no, how could it be moral? God taking out all these people. God taking out all these animals, all these insects and trees and flowers and all these things. How could it be? And this is the most difficult part. Okay, I'm going to ask you now. What is morality? Now, help me with this. What does it mean? Moral.
Upstanding, being good.
Being good. Okay. Anything else?
Code of behavior.
Ooh. Okay. To be honest, I'm going to head there. Yeah, let me give you that. Code of conduct. A code of behavior. A code of conduct, a code of behavior set up to determine what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Okay? Okay, that's kind of the definition. What's the bigger question? The bigger question is this. Who sets up this code? Who sets up this code? Okay, who determines what is good and bad? Who determines what is evil or good? Who determines right and wrong? Who? I'm sorry? God did. But the problem is we've shoved God out the door.
It's up to us.
And it's up to us. Okay? What does Chris think is right? Versus what's Bethany think is right. We got a problem, don't we? We got a problem. Proverbs 21:2. If you're quickly turn to there. Proverbs 21:2. Well-known passage, but let me read this to you so you can see what it says. Let me read just verse 1. Verse 1 is over. Verse 1 and 2. The king's heart, also well-known passage, Proverbs 21:1 and 2. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes. God is sovereign. God is in full control. Does God have control over Putin, by the way? Yes, he does.
Yeah.
Yes, he does. Eric, how does free will? We won't go into. Okay. The point is that God has not lost his job. Putin does not have total free will. God has a plan and a purpose for all that he is allowing to happen. We have to remember that. Verse 2. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes. Okay? Every way of a man is right in his own eyes. The point is, we're good at making up our own sense of what is right and what is wrong. This is where a big part of the problem comes in. So Eric, is stealing right or is it wrong? Well, most cultures would say it's wrong. How about this? Have you ever seen the film Aladdin? Cartoon Aladdin? Some, yes, okay, a few shakes of the head. One of the opening scenes, there's Aladdin, you get introduced to Aladdin, and he's being chased by the guards. Why is it, for you who know the film, why is he being chased by the guards?
He stole bread.
What?
He stole bread.
He stole bread. Why did he steal bread? He was hungry. Was Adam? Was Aladdin? Was Aladdin morally wrong for stealing bread? He was hungry. He wasn't wrong. Okay, no, I'm throwing out the question. Okay, was Aladdin morally wrong for stealing bread?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. What if he was going to die? If he didn't have something to eat? It's just on his own. These are tough questions. These are tough questions. Okay? What one culture says is right, another culture may say something different. There was someone who made a comment one time, and I really like the comment. The comment is this. One culture says to love your neighbor. Another culture says to eat your neighbor. There are cultures in the world that are still cannibalistic cultures. Chad knows what I'm talking about. There are still cultures, believe it or not, in 2022, there are cultures in the world that see it acceptable that if you have enemies, tribal enemies, that they see it acceptable to kill and eat your enemy. Can you believe it? Isn't that incredible? So how then do we determine what is right and what is wrong? If this culture says that within our culture it's acceptable, what's wrong with it? And they look at us and saying, well, what's wrong with you? Why won't you see? Don't you understand our situation? Of course it's acceptable to do that. But we look at them and say, what in the world do you think you're doing? How crazy, how stupid is that? That's why we've got to have a system, a morality that God would say, this is what's right, this is what's wrong. So there is this moral layer. So now because we have shoved God out the door, not only have we closed the door, we've locked the door, put up all kinds of wood and all kinds of bars to not allow God in. So now Chris decides what's right, Jesse decides another system what's right, there's Neil deciding something else, and then what do we have? We have everything all upside down, full of chaos. We have no idea what to do. Because every man and woman does what's right in their own eyes. This is the problem. So now we kind of come down to this. How in the world are we supposed to look at this? How are we supposed to look at this? Okay, we're going to review just a couple of bits, and then I'm hoping to give you a thing or two to think about. Now, I'm not going to solve all your problems in the next 10 minutes. I guarantee you that. I'm hoping to give you something a little bit to think about in this tough thing. How do we look at this? Number one. Did God have the legal right? Did God have the legal right as owner, as sovereign, as the God of this universe to pronounce judgment on the people of Noah? Did God have the legal right? Hope everyone says yes. Okay, God does have the legal right. He is the master, He's the owner, He owns everything. Number two. Does the judgment of the flood emotionally hurt? Does it hurt? Of course it does. Does it hurt us living in 2022? If you would say, Eric, well, this was a long time ago, we just look at it as a story now. If you were to take your mind and go back to that time, and you were to be observing this from afar, would that hurt? You better believe it. When you read what happened in Texas 4 days ago, did that hurt?
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't even know those people. But they're children. Someone went into that school. Who knows what the reason was. I don't even know what all they discovered or not discovered. A young man, 18?
Yeah, he was mad at he shot his grandma before.
Yeah. Some issues for sure. But to go into his school and do what he did, although we know nothing, you've never met any of those children, you've never met this teacher, and then Lisa mentioned that she read, and I read the same story, that after this teacher died, 2 days later, her husband had a heart attack, he died, leaving 4 kids.
Yeah.
Does that hurt us?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why? Because we're created in God's image. Does it hurt God? Absolutely. Absolutely. So just like it hurts us in 2022, we can say that it hurt God up in heaven as well. It hurt God as He watched this. Do you think as Noah had built that ark, he had hammered the last nail as that door was open and those animals had gone up, and as that door closed, by the way, door closed of its own will, or God closed the door. It's an interesting story. God closed that door. And I'd like to say that although we didn't get into it, for 7 more days, the rain didn't fall. And I really think, in my heart of hearts, although we don't have it, if anyone would have said, Noah, can we come in? Do you think God would have let him in? Do you think? I think so. Eric, what's your proof? I don't have any proof. I just think God is graceful. I think God is kind. I think God is forgiving. I think God is God of second chances. But for 7 days, no water, after the door closed. I may be wrong. Been wrong many times. I just wonder. But then the rain came. Do you think God was up in heaven saying, okay, I'm going to get him now, and send him? You think God was like that?
No.
I don't think so. I think God is, as God pushed the rain button, I think He was as heartbroken at that time as He was when Adam and Eve took took of that fruit, she gave to Adam. I think so. I think so. Then the question is, and it's a good question. It's a good question. Eric, if it hurts God so much, and it hurts us so much, why in the world doesn't God just stop it? Isn't that a good question? That is a good question. Why doesn't God stop it? Well, here's something to consider. Here's something to consider. In the West, where we live, I'm not sure in Ukraine, would you guys consider Ukraine the West? Probably Ukraine is still considered in the West. How do we look at pain? How do we look at pain? We do everything we can to avoid it, don't we? Yeah, we've got tablets, we've got hospitals, we've got self-help books, we've got all sorts of things because we don't want to experience anything of pain. Okay, we don't like it. It's not very pleasant. But did you realize that's not how all the world views pain? Is there a purpose to pain? There is a purpose to pain. Well, you've got a hob on. Maybe this has happened in your family sometime. Hob's on, maybe electric, maybe gas. You got a 3-year-old come up. What's that? What do? They touch it. Does it feel nice?
No, not
It hurts, but they won't do it again. There is a purpose to pain. There is a purpose to pain. I know that's a very simple example, and there's much more complicated things. I do like the story, and again, Chad might recognize this story, but I think that's a good story, and then we're going to try and complete this with this last sort of thought in just a minute or so. Can you imagine, here it is, Doncaster Royal Infirmary, the maternity ward. And what do you do in the maternity ward? You give birth to babies. Can you imagine, there's the DRI maternity ward, and all of a sudden, Marvin the Martian comes flying into Earth's atmosphere. He says, well, we're going to visit today. I said, I'll go to England. Well, it's not only just, I'll go to Doncaster. He said, I'm not going to go to Rosso, not much happening over there, but he heard about this DRI thing. So he spins down to Doncaster Royal Infirmary. He couldn't find a place to park. So he had to go and take the park and ride. So he parks a spaceship there at the race course. Gets out of the spaceship, hops on the bus. They look at him kind of weird. He didn't have to pay a pound. So he gets on the bus, goes up to DRI. I thought, where should I go? I'll just go here to this women's maternity ward. And he's standing outside the door of this room where this woman is going through the labor pains of having a baby. And I remember it well enough, and Bethany, close your ears, I don't want you to be put off by anything. And there was, some years back, more so with Courtney and Chad. Chase was not so quite much of an issue. But anyway, sort of the moans and groans and the screams or whatever. And so here's Marvin the Martian outside this door listening to all this stuff. Who is torturing these poor women in there? And then after a while, all of it stops. And you hear this. Everyone's happy and shouting and giving kisses. And Marvin the Martian walks away as confused as ever, having no understanding why, what was going off. Everyone was screaming and there's poor women, all this kind of, and then everyone was happy. Poor Marvin must have been very, very confused. So the point is, sometimes this whole thing of pain and suffering and the reasons for it can be tough. Now, going on to this thing of God and the whole thing of the flood. Was God morally justified? Now here's what we're going to kind of bring this down to. Was God morally justified in doing what he did? I tried to lay a bit of a foundation as best I could in the 25 minutes or so that we've had so far. But the question is, was God morally justified in doing what he did? Does God not say we are not meant to murder? Is that true? Now, this was not until the commandments were given. Who knows what commandment Do not murder. Do you know which one it is? You got a choice of 10. Not fifth.
No, if it's only my father.
Lisa? No. You gotta commit. Give me a number. Nope. Not 7.
Is it number 1?
No, not number 1. Not number 9.
4.
Not number 4. We're whittling. We're about down halfway. 6. There we go. Number 6. By the way, maybe we need to do this again. We had a time when we went through all the commandments and had, I think, a week. Then we had some pictures we drew to try and help you to remember.
I can never remember.
God says we are not meant to murder. Jesus actually talks about it in an even deeper, bigger way. He says in Matthew chapter 5, do you remember this bit? He says, if you're even to look on someone with hate, undue hate, then you've already committed murder in your heart. That's pretty harsh. And have you ever committed murder before? Did you ever look at someone with hate that maybe wasn't quite due? Ooh. Point is, that shows you how real the sin thing is. Now I want us to take ourselves back to the time of Noah. If you saw someone commit murder, kill somebody, should judgment come to that person?
Yeah.
Yes, I think we can all agree to that. If you saw someone steal or rape or all these other kind of things, and you know that they did it, should judgment come on that person? Yes. That's easy. That's easy. How about this? If a child grew up in a time when murder, theft, rape was commonplace, actually to the point where it was so commonplace that it was just assumed that this child would grow up and there was no consequences to these things, as there was in Noah's time. And this child grew up knowing that they could do whatever they want to do with no consequences. What will that child grow up learning to be appropriate behavior? They won't. So they see examples of it all the time.
Carry on.
I would argue that child will grow up, because I've picked up so many phrases here. I love the one that says the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Now, I can't say that I could guarantee for every child, but almost for sure that child grows up seeing that this is a normal, appropriate behavior. You could walk into the Tesco, you could walk into Asda anytime, say, give me your money, and that's acceptable, perfect behavior. You think that child's going to do that?
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. Because remember the whole sin nature thing. That's who we are. And if they see it's profitable, it's easy, there's no consequences, so what are they going to do? So the question is this, and I'm going to leave you with this. What is more compassionate? What is more compassionate? To stop this escalation of horrendous destruction by a sudden event, like a flood, or allow it to continue so that millions die every year, so that millions are raped every year, so that businesses are robbed, terrible things happen day after day after day after day. Which is more compassionate? Which is more compassionate? If I gave you the date of the 6th of August, 1945, pub quiz, what happened on that date, 6th of August, 1945? Clue is 1945. Does anybody know? Okay, more specific though. I'm sorry, Second World War. I need more specific. More specific.
Cold War?
Nope.
Hitler died.
No.
Signed the treaty, didn't it?
Nope. A major event within the war?
Holocaust.
No.
Japanese War?
No. Japanese something, yes.
Hiroshima?
Thank you.
Right. Bombs on Hiroshima.
The atomic bomb, the only of two, that one was on the 6th, I believe, one was on the 9th.
Nagasaki.
Yes. Hiroshima, I think, was the first. Is that right, Al?
Hiroshima first.
The Enola Gay bomber was loaded with that atomic bomb with secret orders to go fly over Hiroshima and to drop that atomic bomb. Now that atomic bomb brought incredible devastation. And they would say something on the tune of 150,000 people died, many of whom were children, civilians.
And there's still something today.
I know. Point being, but that brought a stop to the war. And Japan said, we're done. So the question is, did that bomb, as horrible, and I would never argue that the bomb was good, but was that bomb more compassionate in the grand scheme, in the grand plan? Would 500,000 additional people have died if the war continued another 10 years? So the point is, could the decision was made with the Allied that this bomb would be dropped on Japan, which brought a sudden end to the war, and with the thinking that if we could stop the war, then the ceaseless destruction of people, of children, of all these things would be over, even though it cost greatly. And the challenge is this: if this could have happened in 1945 on the 6th of August, could God, being as all-knowing as He is, could He look down the corridors of time and say, as awful as this is, the way humanity is going, it is far more compassionate to say we need to stop this, wipe it clean, start again with Noah and 3 sons and their 3 wives, 8 people in total. Is that more compassionate?